What's going on, gamers? I am Merkaba18, and today we are bringing you our last 1.0 class guide. We will have some weapon guides, some artifact guides, all that to come out in the coming weeks, but this is the Driller. So the Driller happens to be one of my favorite classes, has one of maybe my favorite subclass as well, maybe even one or two of them. But this is the last class you unlock in the game as a beginner. So we got all of the information that you're going to need to know to play this class effectively. We've got some basics, advanced stats to prioritize, some tips and tricks. We're also going to talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of this guy, and where you're going to want to work on some of your gear. So let's look at the base stats that you get as a driller. He starts with the second highest health, just behind the gunner. He has a decent crit chance and decent critical damage. One thing I'm going to point out to you as we go forward here is that crit is one of the least effective stats for the driller, and I'll talk about why in a second. But basically, crit is going to become a little bit less priority than even any of the other classes, where you're going to want to focus a lot on crit for the scout and to a lesser degree with the gunner and lesser degree with the engineer. The driller is really not going to benefit as much from crit chance, so just keep that in mind as we go. The main concern here with the driller, as is indicated by his name, is that his mining speed is up by 20%, regardless of which subclass you pick. So one of the many reasons he's my favorite class is the mining speed becomes a secondary consideration. With all of these guys, you're going to want to work on some level of mining speed to help you survive a little bit. And you're not going to want to ignore it necessarily on the driller, especially on Hazard 5. It becomes less of a priority because he automatically starts with a ton of mining speed bonuses. So the reason that crit is a problem, or not necessarily a problem, a less of an advantage thing with this particular class and all of the subclasses is that this is a status effect build almost entirely. Every one of the subclasses to some degree or another is going to be focused on status effect and potency. We'll go into all that in a second. And with crit, you can only do crit damage on the initial damage, not the dot or the status effect itself. So like, for example, with the flame, if it applies the flame, there is a chance that you can crit, but each dot from the potency cannot crit. So the initial damage only is where you're going to benefit from crit. The status effect itself does not crit. So keep that in mind as we talk about this. This is the class that benefits the least from crit. All right, so there are three subclasses that you can unlock: the Foreman, the Interrogator, and the Strong Arm. We're going to dive into each one. So the Foreman, where the driller automatically gains mining speed, you're going to gain additional mining speed benefits. Every time that you start mining, you gain a stack of 2% increased mining speed that stacks up to 25 times. So what does that mean? Essentially, you can end up with a 75% bonus to your mining speed if you maintain that stacking bonus there. In addition to that, his mastery gives him more health and damage. His starting weapon is the Subata, which is one of the more underrated starting weapons, in my opinion. It's not necessarily the strongest, but it may be one of the most underrated, and I'll talk about why here in just a second. It is tagged with a light, it is spray, and it is kinetic at start. It is considered a projectile, which just means it's a gun, essentially. So with the Foreman, you're going to notice immediately how much faster this guy mines than everybody else, particularly if you played and did not focus on any of the mining speed upgrades for your other classes. The Foreman is going to be shocking in how fast he mines and how quickly he gets through rock and minerals and projectiles and stuff like that. So bear in mind that this class is going to need to focus on less mining. If you're playing the Foreman, I would say just ignore mining speed as a stat upgrade, because he's going to mine so fast that you're not going to need it. And there's going to be, because of the finite number of choices, I would suggest focusing on other things like movement speed would even be better than mining speed for him. So the Subata can become a fire projectile or an acid projectile. Now, before we go any further, I've waited to sort of dive into the potency until we got to this guy, because potency and status effect is an entire subset of what this character does. So let's dive into some of the basics for what potency is. Potency is going to have different effects depending on the element that it applies to. There's a lot to talk about here, and I'm going to try to walk through it as slowly as I can and as organized as I can I will try my best to do this as slowly as I can. So there are 4 elements in the game outside of kinetic and plasma. There are acid, fire, electric, and frost, or ice, if you will. So with each of those, they're going to do different things. So for fire, it is going to apply a stacking burning effect that does more damage the more you apply it, and the more potency you have. So every time you put a stack of fire on the enemy, let's say there's a target dummy, every time you apply that fire damage, it's going to increase how much it does every time that it ticks. And so potency for fire is going to impact not only just how much of it applies, but how much it adds to that damage over time. Think of that as just like a fire dot. Simplest way to think about it. Number 2 is acid. And in my opinion, acid is one of the, if not the most important status effects in the entire game. Anytime that you can apply an acid weapon to a gun or to a build, it's going to increase your damage exponentially. Because what acid does is every time that you apply it, it's going to do damage, but then it is going to increase your damage done from all sources to that target. So let's say we have a training dummy, we apply 5 stacks of acid, it's going to do a acid tick damage, but then it's going to increase every source of damage that you could do to that target by that much more. Now there's a complicated mathematical formula that goes into that. I'm not going to dive into that today because that's too complicated for a beginner's guide, but essentially think of acid as weakening. It's going to, or vulnerability in some cases, it's going to make that target take more damage regardless of how much or what type of damage that is. That includes fire, kinetic, plasma, ice, electric, everything, including also additionally it's going to take more acid damage. So potency is going to affect how much and how quickly they take that increased vulnerability. Then you have electric, which is going to apply a dot that does a little bit of a damage, dot over time with electric damage, but it's also going to do 2 things. 1, increase the crit chance against that target, and increase the chance that it spreads and does a chain lightning effect. So think of electricity as creating like a web of electricity that springs out from that target while also increasing its chance to be crit. That is the only way, one of the only ways that crit can benefit you as a driller, but to a lesser degree than even other classes, because everything else becomes a status effect modifier. Frost is also going to, Frost isn't about how much damage it can do to the target. It becomes a slowing effect and a freezing effect. So slowing is one effect, and then freezing is when you've applied enough of it to make them freeze. So potency is going to increase how much you slow them and how quickly you freeze them. Critically, it is important to note that almost everything in the game can be frozen, including the Dreadnought. There is one thing I believe that cannot be frozen, and that is the rollers. The elite rollers that can spawn cannot be frozen. At least I've never frozen them. Maybe they potentially or theoretically can be at some point, but I have never seen them frozen. But you can slow them. So that's an important stat for slowing them down, making them move less quickly, and that applies to all of the rollers. Now, I think other rollers can be frozen, just not the elite. The Dreadnought can be slowed and frozen. So keep that in mind as you're moving through this build and this world. Another important note about potency is that there is a stat called status effect and status effect damage. Those, and you'll note this in the tooltip as you see those are only going to apply to electric, acid, and fire. Crucially, it does not apply to plasma or to frost. So status effect and status effect damage are only going to affect those things. Potency, however, can affect all of the elements except plasma. Potency does not affect plasma. So keep in mind, you'll see potency for all weapons, which will apply to everything. Status effect damage will only apply to anything but frost and plasma. I think if you're still with me, let's talk about some more basic stuff and take a little step back now that I had to give that little premise. So the Subata can apply fire or acid as a status effect. So you're going to want to upgrade primarily, in my opinion, you're going to want to turn it into an acid weapon, and then you can pretty much use any other weapon you want from there. So the Subata has a very quick fire rate and a very relatively low damage. So you're going to want to increase reload speed and damage as the top priority, and then fire rate as a result of that as a way of applying more acid damage. And particularly if you're not able to get it into a fire or acid build. Let's talk about the Interrogator. This is why I had to give that little premise, because you first look at this particular character and you're thinking minus 30% damage, but 100% status effect damage. What does that mean? Well, what that means is you're losing the initial damage of 30%, but the status effect damage, fire, acid, and electric, is going to be increased by 100%. You're also, from the mastery, going to be gaining potency and lifetime. Now, lifetime means how long the beam stays up, or how long the weapon lasts on the field. So think of it as duration, essentially, is the same thing. And it gives you access to more fire and acid weapons. Okay, he starts with the Crisper, which is a beam shooter that goes around in a circle. I think it starts with 2. And this can become a very complicated, and to a larger degree as well with strong armed, this can become very complicated to build around because it requires a mental shift in your focus that does not exist on any of the other characters. This one you're going to want to work on lifetime as the primary, because that is going to increase the amount of time that it spins and stays up. If it doesn't do damage, if it's reloading and it's off, the damage is 0. So increasing lifetime is an increase to the damage. Remember that with this and with all of these strong arm builds and with the Interrogator Informant. Lifetime means that it's going to do damage. Lack of lifetime means it's not doing any damage. Then reload speed becomes important, and then potency, and then status effect damage, and then damage is probably the last, because damage is only going to apply to the initial damage, not to the dot that comes later. So the Interrogator and the Strong Arm become all about the dots to some degree or another. And you'll also gain some potency and lifetime and range on these weapons. Now, range means that the beam starts here and it'll spread out as you go. Okay, so like the beam range is also going to increase the amount of application that you can do and how fast you can do it. That becomes very critical too with the frost beams, because they're not going to do as much damage, but they will slow and freeze enemies before they can get to you. And that is why this becomes one of the best builds in the game, because you're going to apply burn, acid, and electric and frost before they can get to you, and it stops them from even doing damage to you. So you're slowing them down, you're applying a ton of damage, and then eliminating them from the map before they can even reach you. And that is why range is also probably more important than some of the other stats like reload speed or damage increases. Bear in mind, too, that there are going to be drones that you can select among these, which can be, we'll talk more about drones in a more in-depth video guide. But the drones are some of the best weapons in the game as well, because they're applying their damage at a larger radius. The other thing to bear in mind with the beams and with the drones is that there are going to be times where you get additional choices. There are legendary choices that increase the number of beams and the number of drones, and those become top flight priorities to some degree or another. We'll talk about that more in the weapon guide video, but anytime you can increase the number of beams, increase the range, increase the potency, and then the lifetime, you're doing more damage across a wider area and more effectively. So bear that in mind for all of these subclasses. All right, now, having given you that PhD lesson, let's dive into the Strong Arm Driller, because the strong arm driller is my favorite subclass in the entire game. This one gives you access to throwable weapons like grenades and a variety of other things. You also can gain access to all of the other subclass weapons that you can have on these guys. But you start with the impact axe, which we'll dive into here in just a second. So this guy gains extra damage and extra HP and 20% increased range. So the beams are going to do more range. The impact axe is going to be thrown further. Drones have a wider radius. Grenades are thrown further, etc. That is one of the main reasons this is a benefit. But the impact axe is one of the best overall starting weapons in the entire game. It doesn't start out that way, but it becomes quickly a very, very, very strong weapon when you build it correctly. So it gains damage and range, and it starts as a kinetic throwing weapon that explodes on impact. So essentially, he's going to throw the axe out, and then it comes back in a boomerang fashion towards you and does damage on its path. It explodes, stays on the ground, and then comes back to you. On the surface, it's going to feel very weak initially. You're going to want to focus heavily on reload speed for this one, and explosion radius to a certain degree, and damage here. And then later, status effect and potency. So what ends up happening is this becomes a acid or fire trail weapon, meaning, and primarily you're going to want to choose acid here. To a lesser degree, fire is viable, but you'll want to choose at least one other acid weapon at some point, and I'll tell you why here in a second. So if you turn it into an acid weapon, it throws the weapon out, leaves a trail of acid for for the enemies to run through, comes back, does the same thing, but it also explodes at the end of that. Turn it into an acid weapon. You're going to increase the range at some point with an overclock. Those are two of the overclocks you're going to want. And then the third overclock, the final one, is going to be Colossus, which makes the explosion bigger and the axe itself bigger and does more damage. So you throw it out, it goes like halfway across the field, comes back, and it's leaving acid trails everywhere. And the more that you're able to reload it faster, the more that that's going to stay out there. And you're basically just covering everything in acid or fire as a result of that. And that is one of the reasons it becomes such a strong weapon, because it does three different things. It hits on impact, it explodes, it comes back, and it's doing trail damage in its wake. If you are unable to get the impact axe into an acid weapon, choose fire, that's fine. But with all of these builds, and with any build in the game going forward, if you are able to access acid, at least one acid weapon will make your build better, because everything else is going to do additional damage as a result of that acid, including the acid weapon itself. So then you're going to want to focus on something like frost and fire, and then electricity to a lesser degree, and then even kinetic damage is fine here, because then eventually all of it becomes a kit in which all of those sources of damage are increased by the acid damage trail. And hopefully everything is getting that application. Things like reload speed, range, lifetime, the same with the interrogator, are going to become a primary focus here. The difference too here is that you're not losing any damage as a result of those focuses like you do with the interrogator. It's going to be less potent to some degree because of those initial starting potencies and status effect damages from the interrogator, but it's going to make up for that in utility, in survivability, and ability to hit things further away. Things like the Viper drone are top tier choices, the cryo cannon are top tier choices, and then any kind of fire weapon, because with those weapons, and particularly with the cryo weapon cannon, you're going to be able to turn it into a fire beam in addition to the slow. It's going to slow and freeze and light them on fire. So that cryo cannon is going to be useful in any build that you can find, no matter what. In terms of gear choices, you're going to want to focus on status effect, potency, reload speed, damage to all, things like that. And one of the things you can really help with this character is by increasing some of the movement speed and his life, because he does have a good amount of starting life, but he doesn't have as much armor. So those are going to be some of the choices that help you survive a little bit better as you go. And range, additional sources of range and stuff like that are good options for this class. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, obviously the biggest strength is that it does tons of damage while also being able to prioritize almost everything else besides mining speed, because he starts mining very quickly right out of the gates. And so you're going to end up being able to get your build up and running faster by not having to choose that global upgrade as much of a priority. Weaknesses are that if you are unable to get some of the status effects to synergize, especially early, it can really kind of hard to make everything else work. If you're unable to focus as much on status effect and potency, the rest of the build kind of falls down. It's also one of the hardest classes to learn and build around. So it's going to take a lot of trial and error here to get it going, because this is, as you might guess from this video, there's going to be a lot that you're going to need to learn and grow into with this class. It requires a completely different mindset than the other three classes, and therefore it can be tough for players to really maximize the benefits here. I hope you've enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making them. We've got a weapon tier list video working, and then overclocks, and then artifacts. We've got some other guides coming out as well. If there are any questions about this particular class or subclasses that I have not answered here, please make sure to feel free to answer or ask them in the comments down below, and I'll try to get to them as I go. Thank you again for watching. Make sure to hit the sub button on the way out, and I'll see you again next time.